Hi, everyone. It is a real pleasure to introduce today's speaker, my longtime friend, Raphaëlle Branche. After teaching as an assistant professor in the University of Rennes and as an associate professor at the Sorbonne, Raphaëlle Branche is currently professor of modern history at the University of Rouen. She's the general editor of 20 et 21 Revue d'Histoire. It's a new title for the former 20e siècle Revue d'Histoire, which is the, as you may know, the flagship journal in modern history in France. Dr. Branche is a renowned specialist of the French-Algerian War from 1954 to 1962. She has published extensively on that topic, including a first book, which was the first book on torture and the French army in the French-Algerian War, published by Éditions Gallimard in 2001. And she's also the author of a number of very important and path-breaking monographs and edited volumes on captivity, Prisonniers du FLN, published in 2014, sexual violence. She published a book on Viol en temps de guerre, co-edited with Fabrice Virgili and translated into English, Rape in Wartime in 2012. And most recently, a special issue of 20 et 21 Revue d'Histoire on irregular comments. But she has published so much that I can't give you titles of all the wonderful books that she has published on the French-Algerian War. So she's interested in the question of illegal violence in wartime and also in the legacies of illegal violence and collective memories. And she has recently started a very exciting and very ambitious research project on French veterans from the French-Algerian War and their families, and the construction of the conflict's collective memory. The topic of Professor Branche's talk today is Ending the French-Algerian War, Amnesty Laws and the Tensions of Memory in France from 1962 to the present. Please join me in welcoming Professor Branche to the High State University and to the Welcome Center. American Center.
Thank you, everybody, for having me here in Columbus. And I want to thank the Merchant Center and Kyle, I haven't met him, but Erin and, of course, Bruno for having me here. It's a real pleasure. So my talk today will be on the French-Algerian War. And let me just start by a few, brief reminder of what is the Algerian War. Basically, you have two main parties that were the French Armed Forces and the Algerian National Liberation Army, the ALN, and the FLN, the Liberation National Front. The French-Algerian War was not simply a war of independence. Of course, it was a war of independence. At stake was the future of Algeria. Would the country and its inhabitants remain under French rule, or would it become a nation of Algerian people, ruled by Algerian people? The French forces tried, of course, to enforce the first option from the end of 1954 until September 1959, when General de Gaulle, the French head of the state, announced that France was willing to consider the future for Algeria that he called self-determination. And yet the war against the Algerian National Liberation Front, which sought full independence, continued until March 1962, that is 2.5 years after. The negotiations between the two parties started in June 1960 and needed several rounds before an agreement was reached on a ceasefire and the future relationships between France and Algeria. That's for the broader picture. On the ground, the war was a guerrilla warfare waged by the ALN against the French military. Basically, ambushes and terrorist attacks. The terrorist attacks also targeted the civilians, either Algerian doomed traitors and accused of collaborating with the colonial administration, or French civilians victims of blind attacks on the streets, in dancing floor, in cafes, etc. So for these acts of violence, the FLN and the ALN people were said to be outlaws and rebels by the French. They were arrested and condemned to imprisonment or even death penalty. 200 of them had been actually executed at the time. The situation is very different on the other side in this asymmetrical war. Yet was it a war? Indeed, French repression was not said to be a war, but maintenance of order operations. It is not before 1999 that the French state officially named this period the Algerian War. But for everybody on the ground in Algeria, the war was obvious and a very dirty one. Indeed, French military had a massive and extensive use of torture against the civilian population and the guerrilla fighters. As I argued in my PhD a long time ago, torture was at the core of the war waged by the French, since it was a powerful tool to compensate the paucity of intelligence that the French had on their enemies, on the one hand, and more importantly, on the other, it was a powerful tool meant to terrorize the population in order to have the people stay away from the FLN and side with the French. No need to say that this brilliant conception totally failed at the end of the day. Apart from torture, the French military perpetrated summary execution on a daily basis. These summary executions being said to be authorized killing of escapers. That is basically the two main types of war crimes committed by the French military. Apart from these two sides, the French and the Algerian, other groups took part in the violence that set Algeria on fire for almost 8 years. From the outset, the war had internecine dimensions. Basically, this conflict had three main dimensions. Algerian nationalists opposing each other. Algerian people engaged in the French armed forces, either by necessity or political convictions, and French people from the secret army organization, the OAS, fighting Charles de Gaulle's political agenda in the final 2 years of the war. So one must also mention a fourth dimension, which is draft dodgers, or French people who supported the FLN by hiding its militants, carrying money, carrying weapons, etc. So let's move to the amnesty. The amnesty is always a state decision. In this case, we will have to take into account several amnesties targeting different groups. The issue of amnesty is different depending on which aspect of the war we considered. While the expectations related to the amnesty were the same, the reality was different, and so were its consequences. Considering the amnesties targeting the members of the OAS, they were used to alleviate the burden of the repression on the OAS members once their threat had been dramatically reduced. In their case, one might consider amnesty as a tool to counter subversion. Yet the main goal of all the amnesties is related to the same issues, that is, to build a peaceful post-war French society. It is from that perspective that I will talk today. I will not so much consider the production of the amnesty, its mechanism, than its consequences on the French society and ultimately on the relation to Algeria and the Algerian people. So I have this PowerPoint here, so probably I'll do that, yeah. So to start with, what is an amnesty? So the word amnesty came from the Greek word amnesikakein, amnesikakein, not remember, remember not. The amnesty was invented by Thrasybulus in 403, before the Common Era, after the tyranny of the 30 had been overthrown. The Greeks meant to reverse the motto, never forget, into never remember, in order to break the cycle of revenge. Each citizen was required individually to swear not to recall the woes of the past. As brilliantly demonstrated by Nicole Laureau, amnesty had a political goal, that was to keep the city united. Amnesty meant the desire for a new future and, as Giorgio Agamben has observed, the acknowledgement of the civil war that preceded. The destructive power of the evocation of the past was undermined by the amnesty. So I will address this issue of the amnesty by taking this goal and this historical origin seriously. So what does that mean, not to remember, in the context of the French-Algerian War? To start with, we have a problem with words. At least I have a problem with words. That is, what is called amnesty about the Algerian War is not only and not exactly an amnesty. And I will, of course, explain. Indeed, you have two different types of decisions that were made in the years following the war. They were meant first to silence the memories, but also, secondly, to grant impunity. So let's start by the first one. The first type of amnesty linked with the first main goal, to silence the memories that might fuel anger and revenge. These laws are the closest from what Nicole Laureau had shown regarding Athens. The amnesty laws following the end of the French-Algerian War shared these characteristics. In 1964, 1966, and 1968, these laws successively addressed each French internal aspect of the armed opposition that took place during the Algerian War. Several presidential pardons were pronounced around the same dates in 1964 and 1968. Thus, you have the executive and the legislative powers that sharing the same interest in forgetting than erasing, or erasing than forgetting, the convictions of dozens of people still in jail or in exile. This history was a strictly French one. Algerians were not concerned, of course, by these laws, since they were out of the prisons with the ceasefire. They marked the complete repression of the last extremist defenders of French Algeria who had attempted to assassinate the president several times. They contributed, these laws and pardons, to the political process of healing the nation's wounds and building a new France after the loss of its empire and the reintegration of almost 1 million people who arrived in metropolitan France from French Algeria in less than a year after the ceasefire agreement. So you really have to build a new France out of this million people, or reintegrate or integrate them into the nation. And amnesty was part of that. The former members of the OAS were included in this amnesty process, as stated by Prime Minister Georges Pompidou in December 1962. I have lots of quotations translated into English, but my English is, as you can hear, not so good. So you can read them probably, and for those who can read French, it's in French either. So what Georges Pompidou is hoping is this reintegration into national life of these people. So, but in fact, the goal, the aim was twofold. He wanted to demobilize the still committed terrorists of the OAS and to set the path for a cultural demobilization of the OAS members, so to speak. What Hubert Bovmery, the famous editorialist, called a moral demobilization. So the electoral agenda was also an issue at that time, especially for the first law of 1964, since the first presidential election by direct universal suffrage was scheduled for 1965. So indeed, almost half of the convicts were released as a result of the pardons and the amnesty of December 1964, just before the election. In the 1968 amnesty law was meant to be like the end of the process. It was meant to be total. As stated in its article, first, full amnesty is granted to all the offenses committed in relation with the Algerian events. So all these laws had an impact on, of course, the narrative of the war. The convictions were not to be mentioned anymore. That's one of the basic things with amnesty. You can't mention the condemnation. But individuals could still claim that their actions had been legitimate, for example. Former members of the OAS were very strongly supported by some milieu, be they political or military, and they published many books to share their visions of the past. And actually they gained a wider audience than their initial supporters in the 60s. This influence was even obvious later in 1982, when France has just elected its first socialist as a president, François Mitterrand. François Mitterrand was a former minister during the Algerian War, and he had made his way up the echelons of the Fifth Republic and had managed to win the support of the communists on the one hand, and of some former French repatriated from Algeria on the other, which is quite surprising. So despite outspoken opposition from its own ranks, the socialists and the communists, he managed to pass a new law, Amnesty Law. However, for the first time in this legislative term, the government had to force the legislation through the National Assembly. Among other provisions, the leaders of the failed coup of April 1961, I don't know if you know of this coup, were reintegrated into the army thanks to this last amnesty of 1982. And they were granted their full rights to a military pension. More than 20 years later, a right-wing assembly passed another law meant to address the situation of the rank and files as well. In 2005, compensation was given to anyone whose court conviction or disciplinary sanction had been amnestied. The vast majority of the people concerned by the law of 2005 were former members of the OAS. And this compensation, like other aspects of the law, illustrated the political influence of nostalgic narratives about French Algeria in France today. Former member of the OAS, a subversive organization that had attempted to assassinate the head of the state on several occasions and had committed hundreds of deadly terrorist attacks against civilians and military personnel, had been remembered as the martyrs of the French Algeria since the 60s. And its vision had gradually gained a wider audience in French society, as maybe we can say French society has proved to be less and less immune to racism and prone to consider the French Empire its grandeur and civilization with some nostalgia. Very different from these laws aimed at restoring civil peace within French society was the amnesty that followed the ceasefire agreement between the French armed forces and the Algerian Nationalist Liberation Army, the ALN. Algerian National Liberation Army, sorry. Here we are moving to the other kind of amnesty I mentioned earlier, and to another goal of the amnesty, that is to grant impunity to the French military. So, are you still with me? Yeah, okay. The ceasefire was due to take effect at noon on March the 19th of 1962. And the Amnesty Decree, not a law, a decree, was issued 3 days later. It was twofold. One concerned the individuals who had been convicted of, quote, taking part in or assisting directly or indirectly the Algerian insurrection, end of the quote, and on the other, at those who committed offenses, quote, during the maintenance of order operation directed against the Algerian insurrection, end of the quote. So behind this appearance of reciprocity, each party was being granted amnesty. The situation was far from symmetrical. During the war, which France considered police operations, a vast French repressive apparatus had imprisoned or detained in camps hundreds of thousands of Algerian people, either convicted or simply suspected of being members or aiding the ALN-FLN. Of course, the FLN had no system of the sort and was completely unable to arrest or to bring to trial French soldiers or policemen. It actually did manage to capture 1,000 of French military personnel or civilians, but never brought them to trial, and of course had the possibility to put them in jail. So the asymmetrical dimension of the war was still very obvious when it came to the amnesty. Indeed, whereas the Algerian had been arrested and convicted or detained, most of the members of the French forces had never had to face any judicial system. Therefore, not only did the amnesty prohibit any criminal convictions or sanctions from being remembered, but it also meant that the very acts that should have been punished by the judicial system would never be punished or could never be mentioned again. To put it even more clearly, French personnel committed war crimes throughout the war, most of them under orders or with their hierarchy turning a blind eye, and no one had prosecuted them, and no one would ever be able to do so. As the active whistleblower and historian Pierre Vidal-Naquet argued in 1962 in a book called La Raison d'État, you can read, no text would have absolved more totally the criminals of the military and police forces. It's indeed a legitimization. Okay, so the question is, was it really the intentions of the French authorities to grant France's army and police total impunity through this amnesty? And the answer is undoubtedly yes. An amnesty was expected within the army ranks before the war ended. In this sense, the amnesty did not set a new pattern of responsibility and remembrance. It actually consolidated the groundwork laid by the French forces in Algeria from the beginning of the war. In a nutshell, war crimes such as torture, summary executions, or the use of prohibited weapons were committed. The civilian authorities were aware of this and either unable or unwilling to stop the military, provided that they were winning the war, of course. Even when autonomy for Algeria was put on the agenda, the military was still given free rein. The only limit would be open protest against the political agenda, so the OAS. When he decided that French Algeria was not to live long, General de Gaulle acted to regain control of the military forces by sparing its men in all possible senses. The first reference to an amnesty indeed dated back September 1958, just after de Gaulle came back to power. By referendum, French citizens agreed to change the constitution, and the war in Algeria was a legacy of the Fourth Republic, of course. For a while, the Fifth Republic considered the possibility of an amnesty that would erase all the crimes committed under the former regime by the French forces. In an open speech to the guerrilla fighters, General de Gaulle offered what he called the peace of the brave, a sort of virile oath from man to man, whereby guerrilla fighters would be granted fair treatment if they surrendered. The proposal did not attain its goal, even though we know that it was discussed within the ALN Maquis. The war went on, repression went on, it became tougher from that date on, actually. All the French army managed to reverse the situation on the ground in 1959, 1960. A new political outcome from the war was still on the agenda, as I mentioned earlier. So 3 days later, at the end of the war stood in the offing, the civilian authorities in Algeria gathered information concerning what the army called, quote, the acts of repression conducted by the military, les actes de répression menés par l'armée. They particularly wished to resolve the issue of what they called the disappeared people, and have all the family received a declaratory judgment of death. The Délégué Général, who represented the French government in Algeria, informed the military of the government's determination to, quote, contribute to fixing the material and moral consequences of the events of Algeria, whoever the victims were. For the military, the main concern was very different. They wanted to have their impunity secured. When war crimes were committed, they were very rarely sanctioned or condemned. Most of the time, the victims were unable to complain or to go to court. More broadly, a portion of these war crimes had indeed been legitimized by the state as counterinsurgency methods, especially two of them that I mentioned earlier. Yet these methods were forbidden under the law and should therefore have been legally prosecuted. So when prosecution rarely took place, military personnel were judged by military courts. In 1961, these courts were blatantly stalling the process in order to gain time. The unwillingness was obvious in two very famous cases, the most famous cases of the war, made public by committees set up in defense. That is Maurice Audin and Jamil Abu Pasha. Maurice Audin disappeared in the hands of the military in 1967. He was said to have escaped. The supporters of this case argued that he had been tortured to death. Abu Pasha was accused of setting bombs, but her lawyers argued that she had been tortured and raped in 1960, and that her torturers and rapists should be prosecuted as well. In both cases, also highly publicized, the military opposed great resistance to any demand to help identify the military personnel involved. Other cases found their way to court. The death by torture of Sadia Mebarek was one of the last ones. In January 1962, the officers held responsible for a death under torture were acquitted. At that date, of course, the amnesty was expected. Judges already shared the conviction that soldiers should not be punished for action that had been encouraged by many military instructions and that complied with the spirit of the repressive guidelines and were frequently presented as being very efficient to win the war. Arguments had reached metropolitan France as well, and judges ruled for acquittals there too. So although the archives on the topic have not been thoroughly scrutinized, some cases are known to us. A year before the Mebarek case, in March 1961, another officer had already been acquitted in Paris. He was prosecuted for the death of 6 people. One of de Gaulle's judicial advisors merely had to comment, quote, "The present situation is worrying since it's transforming the judicial privilege of the military into a lack of justice, the privilege being to be judged by its peers." He demonstrated no hope for change and exposed his view to de Gaulle, attitude of the military tribunals were, quote, "one of the numerous manifestations of the trouble the nation has run into due to the Algerian War," end of the quote. He therefore suggested that the war crimes be put on the negative part of the balance of the Algerian conflict and that the first opportunity be seized to pardon such offenses. So the opportunity was seized indeed on March the 22nd of 1962 with the decree that made it possible to dismiss all proceedings. For instance, the Jamil Abu Pasha case was dismissed in April 1962. The acts of violence committed while she was arrested and detained were undoubtedly part of the maintenance of order operations. Therefore, the public action had to be dropped. The consequences of the decree would be seen, of course, in the longer term. And we have to scrutinize 2 situations. When a judicial fine existed and when there had never been a judicial action against anyone related to the maintenance of order operations. So at that stage, I wanted to say a little thing about the archives, but probably I won't. No, I won't. Well, I'll go back later. Well, just basically, that's how it's, when you look at the archives, you have this stamp mentioning the amnesty, which is quite interesting because the stamp is not on, on the written thing. So you can still read the condemnation and you can know it has been amnestied. Whereas, for example, we had the problem for the Second World War where black ink was used, on the words, and you cannot read them anymore. But the good thing is, and the good news was for me to know that they used stamp and not black ink, and that. So well. What if the crimes? So that's for crimes that have been at least prosecuted or even led to condemnation. The situation, of course, is totally different for crimes that were not prosecuted. So the amnesty forbade prosecution of people for deeds, very strange word, deeds, committed during the maintenance of order operation against the Algerian rebellion. That's the quotation. So from then on, it was impossible even to name any military personnel whose responsibility in war crimes was obvious. The legal system would stand in defense of any man who would claim that his respectability or his honor had been attacked or has been attacked. So libel suits would take place and would be won by the plaintiff, except if he had publicly claimed that he had indeed committed such crimes or such acts or such deeds. Of course, it's very rare. So even if a libel suit is won by someone, a victim, naming the perpetrators, no other judicial impact is to be expected. Okay, because of the amnesty, or thanks to the amnesty. So most of the soldiers involved in crimes during the war were conscripts. And interestingly, as veterans, they were not in a hurry to address the issue of war crimes. They had to wait 13 years after the war to be granted the status of veterans. The association have continued to lobby until today to broaden the criteria required to be granted this recognition of as veteran. War crimes, of course, have not been on their agenda at all, never. However, since 2000, former rank-and-file soldiers have spoken out, and they've written their memoirs mentioning crimes such as rape, torture, napalm bombing, summary executions of prisoners, etc. And this new awareness does not mean that they take responsibility, of course. Indeed, no one will hold them or their hierarchy accountable. So it's interesting for historians because they speak freely, because they are not threatened by any possibility of being, prosecuted. From the former hierarchy's point of view, the situation was quite clear. The French army, after 1962, had to move on. Individuals who had been compromised in the failed coup of 1961, and more broadly, who had been committed to Algeria, remaining French until the end, were dismissed, or they were invited to leave the armed forces. Conscripts were discharged, and they were sent home. No lessons actually were learned from the defeat, since the officers felt, and it's a very strong narrative in the army, that the war had been won on the ground. The blame was put by the military on the French politicians or on the geopolitical changes in the world, the end of empires and so on. This line of argument has long been very powerful. The war was lost by the politicians, not by the military. A military victory was overruled by a political defeat. And indeed, the civilian authorities had to regain control over the armed forces after this more than 7 years war that had followed, an 8-year war in Indochina, and for some officers' action during World War II. So letting this line of argument develop quietly within the ranks of the armed forces would be the price to pay to regain confidence. But a very dangerous path, according to me. In parallel, the French army in the 60s exported some of its officers to be advisors in several Latin American or African countries. What they called modern war, the Revolutionary War doctrine, etc., were part of the French know-how against subversive activities, what they call subversive activities. The efficiency of its methods was unquestionable, as was their legality. The proof of the pudding was in the eating, and the Algerian War had been won on the ground by tailor-made methods. I will not talk about the coin here, of course, but yet the link with the amnesty needs to be stressed. If no one had ever been prosecuted or convicted for torturing or making people disappear during the Algerian War, why not recommend these methods as useful and efficient? Impunity paved the way for these practices to spread during the war, as did the amnesty after the war. The line of argument and the justification of war crimes were not made public, of course. The military does not speak publicly. I think it's probably the same here. And the people who had tried to monitor these crimes during the war would probably have protested any public justification. It was not until 9/11 that French former officers who had tortured or assassinated people during the Algerian War came regularly to the fore, notably on TV, on French TV, to justify the use of torture with the same kind of arguments that had been used during the war, essentially the ticking bomb argument. So the war against terror, waged by George W. Bush, had unleashed debates, not only in France, on the need to commit what were under all laws, war crimes. The situation is quite different when we look at the other amnesty, the one concerning former members of the OAN, so let me go back to this one. So convicted, then amnestied and pardoned, their crimes had been told. So that's very different. Thanks to the amnesty, they were authorized to live freely in France and would engage a fight over the justification of their acts, crimes, according to the courts. The judicial terrain was apparently deserted, but the editorial terrain or the public memory became a battleground on which former militants or convicts would try to convince and to impose their views. In 1982, before the law was passed, one of the 4 generals who plotted against the Republic in April 1961 and then joined the OAS could address a large TV audience praising the amnesty in these words. Talking about reparation means a lot to us. It means that we were not to be blamed for all the wrongs. It's a kind of rehabilitation of our history as Pieds Noirs. Well, lots of things about that, but because they were not all Pieds Noirs, but Jouot was a Pieds Noir as well. So words such as martyr of the French-Algerian, words like sacrifice, were commonly used to dismiss the legitimacy of the courts and convictions in the 60s. And they gained, as I said before, a wider audience in the 80s. Indeed, a struggle for memory and recognition was engaged in the long run. Hatred also still strongly bound the militants. For instance, in 2007, the General Assembly of one of the biggest lobbies referred to the death of Pierre Vidal-Naquet in the following terms. He, quote, he left to join the throat cutters of the FLN, whom he loved so much, end of the quote. And the meeting started with an homage to, quote, our fallen comrades died while fighting Stalinist Gaullist villainy, end of the quote. It was 10 years ago. They even succeeded in placing a plaque at the bottom of the war memorial erected in 2003 in Paris. This plaque commemorated French civilians killed by the military a few days after the ceasefires in Algiers on March the 26th. The civilians had responded to the OAS call not to let the military penetrate the urban zone where the clandestine organization was hiding and launching its attacks, particularly against the French military personnel, who were labeled by the OAS foreign troops. So the military shot into the crowd and they killed dozens of people, probably around 50. The preceding days, 25 military personnel had been assassinated by the OAS. Thanks to the determined lobbying of the former OAS activists, these men and the civilian victims were commemorated as at the same memorial in Paris. To boot, the civilians' names are even added to the memorial. I don't know if you know, of course you don't know that the memorial is it's not on the ground, it's like long columns with electronic names, you know. So you can add any name you want. It's just nobody noticed. Okay. So they were added in 2010, these names of the martyrs of the French-Algerian. At that stage, the victim paradigm had widely succeeded. Surprisingly, though, the closer individuals were to active violence, the greater their chance to be acknowledged as victims. Starting with the OAS members, this dynamic was clear for the former Algerian auxiliaries of the French army as well. In 2003, they were granted a National Day of Remembrance on September the 25th. It's what we call the Arquis. Maybe you know about them. As for the French soldiers, it took their association 25 years to gain official recognition of the war, 1999. At the end of 1974, they were named veterans under specific criteria, but no war. Quite a strange situation for 25 years. So the lobbies were very active in widening the criteria and in naming the war. But the violence of the war was not really stressed, of course. What the veterans insisted on was their unwillingness to go to war and the brutal character of it. So their discourse was largely one of victimization. So victim everywhere. So what about those who were the only victims or just victims of the war? I mean, not people who were both victims and perpetrators, but just victims. So basically the Algerian civilians. The amnesty silenced them. Although hundreds of thousands of Algerians lived in France after the war, their vision of the war in Algeria was totally ignored by the French public. No judicial action was possible. The only valid cause of action would have been by filing a libel suit, as I already mentioned, but no one did. Probably I skipped that too. No, I have time. 10 minutes? Okay, great. No one did, but there is one very interesting case. That's the case of a man, an Algerian, who managed to break the silence by filing a suit with a pension court. His name is Mohamed Garn. Mohamed Garn is born in 1960 out of a rape in a resettlement camp during the war. And he filed a suit in 1998 to obtain a pension on the grounds that his mother had been raped several times and then beaten in order to miscarry, or to make her miscarry. He found out the truth about his birth and his mother decades after his birth. He was partly raised in an orphanage. And he claimed a pension for these too, not knowing the truth about his birth. The judicial process took 3 years. In the end, Mohamed Garn was granted a pension. The court psychiatrist insisted that Mohamed Garn had numerous psychiatric disabilities, all of them, quote, attributable to the state's responsibility. The judges reluctantly followed the expertise, even though they reduced the percentage of disability from 60% to 30%. But more importantly to our topic are the words of the public prosecutor, who acknowledged the reality of the multiple rapes. In the wings of this trial, so to speak, a state official actually acknowledged that French soldiers committed rapes. Admittedly, no rapist, of course, was named, and no trial would ever be possible due to the amnesty. Yet some sort of public discourse made its way to the public thanks to this highly publicized case of Mohamed Gham. The Mohamed Gham case raised two issues regarding the amnesty. First, was it possible to grant a pension to a victim of acts of violence that had been amnestied? Second, was it possible for an Algerian to file a suit in France? So the answer to the first question was obviously yes. Although the crime had been amnestied and no culprit ever condemned, the French state could name it and recognize it. And it was on the grounds that rapes had been committed that the child's disabilities were compensated. The answer to the second question considerably narrows the scope of the victims, since Mohamed Gham's case has been investigated because he was a French citizen indeed. He had been granted the nationality earlier in the 90s. So although his case had high stakes for the French state, its eventual impact was minor because Gham was a French citizen, and the court-appointed psychiatrist was a veteran who knew the specificities of the war, contrary to the younger ones who do not. I'm not aware of any other cases in front of the pension court. Some people might have tried and get some compensation, I don't know. Yet a dramatic twist, and I'll finish my talk with that, happened last February, a year ago, when an Algerian man won his case in front of the Constitutional Court in France. In 1962, we need to go back to 1962 for a second. In 1962, as a consequence of its independence, the Algerian state, the new Algerian state, had to endorse the decisions voted in 1955 by what was called at that time the Algerian Assembly, basically the colonial parliament of Algeria. So it had to endorse everything. In 1963, despite the fact that the Algerian state refused to pay, the French law made it very clear the French state would take into consideration any claim for compensation for acts of violence committed during the war, if and only if this claim came from a French citizen. So Algeria had to pay for Algerians, and French had to pay for French. Yet, in 2014, Abdelkader K, an Algerian man living in France, asked for a pension. So he's not a French citizen. He asked for a pension. As a child, he had been injured during a terrorist attack in Algeria. So he is a victim of the war. His claim led to the February decision of last year, stating that no restriction of nationality is to be made against any claimant. That's a huge decision. The French state had to grant him a pension. Following on that decision, any civilian living in Algeria today, or of course living in Algeria, during the war, is eligible to ask for compensation for a terrorist attack or any other act of violence related to the events of the Algerian War. Very vague. But the Constitutional Court stated that its decision acting against discrimination based on nationality was motivated by, quote, an objective of national solidarity, which is a very interesting phrasing in this post-colonial decision, national solidarity, including the Algerian. So what are the particular consequences of this decision in light of the effects of the amnesty? Indeed, this decision opens wide the gates for people to ask for pensions as victims or eligible, even survivors. As in the Mohamed Gham case, in order to assess the damages, the pension courts will require an assessment of the acts of violence. So at best, victims will be recognized, but of course, no perpetrators will ever be named or sanctioned. The effect of prescription and amnesty compound the silence about their responsibility. Yet the possibility of awarding the victims some compensations means that the state and the nation is taking responsibility for these acts. So this is quite a serious path that will not endanger the civil code, but may at last lead France to facing for the first time its responsibility in waging a war against civilians. So the court's decision did not erase the amnesty, but it set a path for a way to sort of circumvent it legally. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Time for questions. Yes.
Would you make some comments about the role of amnesty in l'affaire Audin?
Yes. Indeed, it's quite simple. L'affaire Audin has been arrested on the ground that he was a communist and he was behaving. He was having clandestine activities, and so he was suspected of, threatening the state and all that. But the l'affaire Audin is not about Audin as a culprit. It's about his torturers. So you never had a trial in the Audin case. The military made it, a wait. They didn't. A judge was appointed, and he asked, for example, for pictures or information, and the military delay, the answers as much as they can. And at the end of the war, nothing has happened. So the amnesty came as a closure for the military personnel. It's a little tricky because it's different for the police personnel, but you had another amnesty later, a few years later, that sort of finishes the work, and so it's nothing special in this way, in this sense. It's just a war crime that has never been. The difference, of course, is about the publicity it received at the time of the war and after, thanks to his widow and Pierre Vidal-Naquet and many militants, but on judicial terrain, just the amnesty, as far as I know.
After the war, were there any cases of Algerian civilians who unsuccessfully asked the French state for compensation, or did Amnesty not even allow that?
The amnesty is does not, it's not on the same ground, because compensation would be like pension, and so probably, the amnesty doesn't forbid to do that, but I don't know if they're trying. Actually, I don't know. Nobody actually. I had a look at this pension court's files, but I doubt the fact that they did.
I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about how the amnesty that was developed in response to the Algerian War, was it all related to or done in light of the amnesties that were offered in the wake of the Second World War? Yeah. I know you compared the sort of the text, and it's very interesting to see that they didn't block things out, but knowing that there were sort of a series of amnesties that sort of sent out in the 1940s and 50s, whether there were similarities between the two, or?
Can I add my own question? Because also a question on that, the memory. I was struck by the quotes, the talk that Pompidou gives in December
1962. Yeah.
Individuals who were mainly victims of the events, and I think it's almost at the same time that he mentions, or is it de Gaulle with him, who mentioned the times when the French were divided. So it's the same kind of attitude to the past that Oli Rousseau has studied too. So do you think that it's a broader issue? It's not specifically about the memory of the French-Algerian War, but it's also a relationship, rather an issue of the relationship of the government or the French state and this divided past, whatever it is.
I know. Well, at least you have, similarities are everywhere between the Second World War situation and the Algerian War. many people, at the time, and newspapers are full of comparison, and comparison is not reason, so it's very different indeed, but yeah. But yet, of course, there is this issue of a divided France that needs to be reunited in a new future and to go forward. So yes, I suppose you have some sort of goalist way of uniting the nation and taking care of the wants and yeah, I suppose the main issue at that time for Pompidou and de Gaulle was the one, well, minor pied noir, coming back, coming for the first time on the French soil or metropolitan soil, and lots of them having been not in action but in mind with the OAS or siding, with the OAS for, to keep Algeria French. So it was really an issue for him to have this wide part of the new French society, taken into account and given, jobs and houses, and you do have lots of policies targeting them in order to have them, with France and the new France. So it's, the amnesty and the OAS is really part of the huge, and this is very different from France 1945, because France in 1962, it's a very wealthy country. It's possible, to have all this like welfare state policies targeting these people, which is, historical opportunity really. And as far as the judicial dynamic of amnesty and the comparison with Second World War, actually I haven't seen mention of it, but the personnel were, some of them the same, and the counselor that I quoted about, you need to, do something that to build a new France, was a very close counselor of de Gaulle in 1944, 1945. So probably it's, like a milieu of men that even didn't really need to write down all this, but they had it in mind, and we don't want that to happen again. But the real difference is, the question that this amnesty is not a real amnesty for many things. So, okay for the OAS, but not for the others. So, the issue of the relationship to the military is a very big one. That is quite different, from the situation in 1945, but I'm not a specialist at that time, but I suppose. But yes, you do have this. And French people were, French people were quite used to the amnesties, because you have several amnesties in the 50s, and the biggest one being probably the 1953 amnesty about Oradour-sur-Glane, and it has been a huge, public emotion. Yeah, so.
And they use the same rhetoric, right?
Absolutely.
Now they knew, like, we were not, this wasn't a choice for us.
Absolutely, victimization. Yeah.
Alice?
Thank you, Raphaëlle. I had two questions. One is my ignorance, but war crimes, is that a statute and a content that's stable, or was there lots of debate over what actually constituted war crime throughout this period? And then the second was, so the role of the courts in France, it's very striking, the last example you gave of the sort of alternative path. And so do you think of courts as sort of really independent of political power or throughout this period, and what role, how important was the role of the courts?
During the war?
No, after. In some of these.
The recent decisions. Okay. Very touchy question. The war crimes, of course, it's a historical category, but and it's my word. I mean, but it's something that should have been said because you have laws of war, you have the Geneva Conventions, and everything that is not that is forbidden by the Geneva Convention is war crimes. So torture is absolutely and it's considered such by the French. You have lots of texts, during the war stating that of course torture is forbidden, of course torture is illegal, and of course. So it's not retroactive judgment or something. It's just the way it was at that time, at the state of what the legal situation was. Yeah. So summary executions of civilians and torture were undoubtedly war crimes. And rape, of course, but not used so extensively. Second question regarding the political and the independence of the Constitutional Court. I'm not really good at this, but the Constitutional Court is, you have members that are former presidents, that's right? President of the Republic, yeah. So it's a sort of mix of people coming from the justice side and people from the political side. So, I don't know what is independence, but they are, free to decide whatever they want, and they are seized by anyone. So actually, like this Abdelkader K and his lawyer just came, and so yeah, I suppose it's more or less independent. At least, well, it's within the society and all that. But yeah.
I'm still wondering what were the motives of the government in the 60s for implementing these amnesty laws.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if their main reason was mostly to regain the confidence of the army because of the broken relationship between the army and the government during the Algerian War.
It's not so well. The army is not so much on the agenda because it's not the OS. Well, you have former members of the army who deserted to join the OS, but they are not considered military personnel. So I don't think it's the right way of. Well, probably I have to think more, but
because I'm wondering if the OAS had so much influence on the government that the government would decide to do that.
Oh, it's not the OS lobbying. It's not the OS lobbying. It's more like all the Pied Noir community, and more broadly, part of the right wing, not the Gaullists, but the right in France, not the Pied Noir community, but also people opposing de Gaulle, who were trying to, who de Gaulle tries to seduce in a way. So it's part of the political reconfiguration of the 60s, I think, more than to do with the military. And the other thing I didn't mention is that amnesties were not only targeting the former member of the OS, you also had amnesties for the police and the police members, and also for draft dodgers and people helping the FLN. So, the other part, I mentioned three dimensions of, internal struggles. And so the other part was also addressed. So you had this within the same laws. So it's something like, we want the country to be reunited again by de Gaulle. And he is the one able to do that. At a time where it's not so evident for, de Gaulle it has been not so easy in 1965 to win the election, and even in 1968, it's in July, so it's just after May, and it has something to do with this, very precise chronology. So de Gaulle has been, on the verge of, being strongly contested. So it's part of this reassurance of de Gaulle, I think, at least. But there is an issue with the army in the 60s definitely, and we don't know more, we don't know enough, we don't know, yeah, we have to know more about that, and I'm still waiting for a nice PhD on the topic. So I mean, the nuclear aspect is you know, it's a basic thing about that, and OTAN, NATO.
I was struck by the pension court's kind of creation of this mechanism for recognizing victims without specifically naming perpetrators or prosecuting them, and it just, the similarities occurred to me at the recent discussion happened in the U.S. with some political candidates endorsing the issue of reparations for slavery, and the same type of recognition of these victims without pointing to specific perpetrators, specifically that can't be done. Of course, across the passage of time, but just the debate surrounding it have shown how threatening that is to some people's image of the nation and who and what the nation is. I was wondering if the same type of debates are taking place in France, with people extremely upset on certain things in the political spectrum about the recognition of.
No, I mean, this very recent decision, as I mentioned, is a very huge one. It's I mean, I know people in Algeria working for the French government were just totally frightened, you know, when they heard that, wow, we were gonna be, you know, overthrown, you know, by you know, claims, but it didn't happen. It didn't happen at all. And I have, you know, I suppose we can have a guess of why it did not, but it didn't. You know, you had, you know, it was on the news for one day, and now not really. You know, people not really noticed it, or just slightly. But it would be different if, you know, you had hundreds of thousands of people really, you know, asking for a recognition, but it did not happen. And one of my hypotheses is that people would need help to, you know, have their claim to build, and the Algerian state, who usually loves to portray France as, you know, the bad colonial power, has been totally silent on the topic. You know, it was just like a very nice, you know, on the tray, you know, like, you can do whatever you want and say we were all victims, and nothing. So, yeah, that's very, yeah. Well, why not? Why not? But they did not, because you have criteria. I mean, you cannot just say I've been a victim. You have to prove lots of things. So it's not so easy to get it, of course.
One final question. Yes.
Last one. Would you say that the issuance of several amnesties between the end of the Second World War and the beginning of this one affected the conduct of the French army in Algeria, because they sort of expected impunity even if they went outside the realm of law? Or was there a progression where, as time went by, they resorted to more unlawful actions?
I can't not imagine them. I mean, them. Who is this? But I mean, officers, or because, you know, the war. I cannot imagine them, you know, having this sort of rationality and you know, the sense of the past, and because this act of violence, illegal violence, really came from the ground. In a way, it was not like, you know, we are deciding to, because, and we will grant the amnesty after that. And no, it's not. It was more like, you know, locally based, and then taken into a broader narrative of, you know, justification, of course, and even training. But at first, it came really from, you know, the new war they had to face, or not so new actually, but they felt like it was new, or at least unexpected on the Algerian soil. So no, I won't say, I won't go into this direction. I think that another direction would be probably more effective or just, would be the colonial, you know, the fact that in a colonial situation you don't expect justice to be just. It's just, you know, siding with the powerful. So, and it's a colonial warfare. So You don't need to be granted impunity at the end. You are expecting impunity from the start, in a way. No?
Thank you, Raphaëlle. Thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome.